In 2019, Frank and I cycled the EuroVelo 17 route, which follows the River Rhone from its source in the Swiss Alps to the south coast of France on the Mediterranean Sea. We had actually started this cycle journey about a month earlier at the beginning of May at the Atlantic coast of France west of the city of Nantes, where we dipped our toes in the sea and then made our way east across the country on EuroVelo 6, clocking up a total of 1,487 kilometres. This route took us along the Rhone Valley, where we enjoyed camping on the sandy banks of what is France's last great wild river. We explored its chateaux, vineyards and historic villages. Leaving the Loire behind, we followed canals through beautiful countryside as we continued east with, thankfully, gradually better weather, through the Doubs Valley, into Alsace, and eventually across the border to Switzerland and the city of Basel, which would be our jumping off point for the next stage, the start of EuroVelo 17. EuroVelo 17 starts in the mountain town of Andermatt, which is about 180 kilometres from Basel, or Basel as I should probably say, or Bâle in French. We decided to take a train from Basel to Andermatt, so after a night at a hotel, a helpful English-speaking lady at the Bahnhof sorted us out with tickets for our bikes and us, at a total cost of 166 Swiss francs, which included 14 francs each for the bikes. Not having any experience with taking bikes on trains in Europe, we wondered how this would go, as there would be 2 train changes, presumably with platform changes, the second one with only 4 minutes between trains. If there would be stairs to negotiate, we figure we'd surely be screwed. Anyway, aside from this little worry, we were looking forward to some Swiss scenery on this 3-hour train ride. The train changes went quite well. In both cases, the platforms were on the same level, and with good teamwork between the two of us, we managed quite well with the bikes and panniers. The third train from Göttingen to Andermatt was only a 10-minute ride, so we just stood with our bikes. It was one of those cog railways that you see in the mountains, and the grade was so steep that we had our hands on the brakes the whole time so the bikes wouldn't slide down the carriage. Bright skies awaited us in Andermatt, for a short while anyway, before the rain came, forcing us to cook dinner in the shelter of the tent. During the night, Frank had to run after a fox who tried to steal our food bag from the vestibule. We had discovered that the Furka Pass was still closed due to snow and wouldn't open for another 2 weeks. This was to be our route to the source of the Rhone in a glacier on the other side of the pass, so we had to find a plan B. Fortunately, there is a train that uses a tunnel through the mountain that is open all year and would take us to the village of Oberwald, 14 kilometres downriver from the source. And just maybe a little part of me was quite okay with not having to ride up that 1,000 metre of elevation gain, although I'm sure it would have been lovely to see that alpine scenery. The train transported us to warm sunshine in Oberwald in the Upper Valley region, where we quickly found the paved cycle path and got our first look at a very young Rhone River. We were finally starting the ride, but progress was very slow for the first while as we were so taken with this beautiful landscape with its quintessential lush meadows with herds of perfect-looking animals, villages with characterful timbered buildings, the wood darkened by years of weathering, and everything perfectly tidy and manicured as you expect in Switzerland, the cemetery being no exception. Our first cycle day wasn't a big mileage day, 36 kilometres, but the scenery was stunning and we got to experience our first Swiss campground in the little town of Fiche. Expensive at 31 Swiss francs, but with impeccable facilities. Our second day on the bikes brought some more beautiful mountain scenery. The signage is very good, but here in Switzerland you will see more prominent signs for Route 1 than for EuroVelo 17, as this is a national cycling route which EuroVelo 17 follows. Some of the paths looked snowy due to the layer of fuzz from the poplar trees on the ground. It got noticeably warmer the further down the valley we went, but we did encounter the infamous Rhone wind, blowing down the valley, so we had it at our backs mostly, except for brief periods when we were riding sideways to it, and then it was almost impossible to keep your balance. We were never far from the ever-growing River Rhone. In the town of Sierre, we had an afternoon beer by the plaza. This place is at the boundary of the German and French-speaking areas of Switzerland. It also marks the beginning of this valley's wine region. Speaking of which, we were really surprised to see how many vineyards there were. This might be Switzerland's best-kept secret. Apparently they export only about 2%, so that's why we don't hear about it. Day 2 brought a lot of downhill riding, and we clocked up 75 kilometres on a mixture of dirt paths, paved paths, small roads, and a little bit on a main road. From Fiche to near Brig, we were on a main road with no shoulder, but traffic wasn't bad. We chose to do this to avoid a section of the official trail that we heard was very steep and rocky and better suited to mountain bikes. From Suston to Sierre was also on a main road, but this one had a bike lane. Tonight's camp was of the wild variety, beside a little lake about 10 kilometres past Sierre. At this point we were within striking distance of Lake Geneva, otherwise known as Lac Léman, and we're also not that far from the French border. Ahead of us, the Rhone Valley takes a sharp turn to the north at the town of Martigny. But we would have one more night of camping before reaching the lake, with some gorgeous scenery along the way. We clocked up 78 kilometres of fairly flat riding today and found a campground in the picturesque town of Aigle, just off the route. The impressive Château d'Aigle houses a wine, vine and label museum, a nod to the area's importance in the wine industry. EuroVelo 17 has routes on both the north and south shores of Lake Geneva. We were taking the north route as we planned to visit friends in Lausanne. Besides, we wanted to see the famous ancient level vineyards on the slopes between Montereau and Lausanne, which are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The day started off fairly dull and soon turned to rain as we approached Lake Geneva. I had idyllic images of the lake in my mind based on pictures I had seen, but the reality turned out to be somewhat different. We weren't going to be getting any views of Mont Blanc across the water today. We did have a lovely visit with Frank's friends in Lausanne, and they took us for a little drive to see the famous vineyards, looking particularly well irrigated today. We spent the next 2 nights in a little hotel in Lausanne, hoping that the clouds would lift, but it wasn't to be. All was not lost, as Lausanne is a great city to explore. It has one of the finest Gothic churches in Switzerland. And it's also the headquarters of the International Olympic Committee, so a visit to the Olympic Museum was a very enjoyable rainy day activity. As Mont Blanc was not about to show its face, it was time to move on in spite of the soggy conditions. We got back on the bikes and headed west along the very built-up and busy north shore of Lac Léman. Nevertheless, the cycle route signage did a great job of leading us through quiet roads and historic villages scattered with farmland and orchards. The rain came down, but our spirits were lifted when we got a phone call later on inviting us to come and stay with the daughter of our French friends who lived down south, the ones we're going to visit later. We'd never met their daughter and her husband before, and they lived a bit off our route in a tiny village across the French border, northeast of Geneva. But we were delighted to take the detour to enjoy the evening with them and be warm and dry in a comfy bed. This welcome detour took us through delightfully quiet countryside under the slopes of the Jura Mountains, completely bypassing Geneva, which we didn't mind at all. We eventually rejoined the official trail after crossing the Rhone under the shadow of the prominent Mont Vauche. Once back on the Via Rhona, as the French section of EuroVelo 17 is called, we did have to ride on a busy road where the Rhone passes through a narrow gorge. We ended the day in the lovely village of Basel, the highest navigable point on the Rhone. Its nicely appointed campground borders the cycle path and the river, and that was the setting for dinner in the campground restaurant tonight. It was noon before we hit the trail on day 7 after a leisurely morning enjoying the sunshine at our lovely campsite. The Rhone has a couple of splits in it in this area, so at times we were following a more canal-like section. The area around Chanaz was really pretty. It's known as the Little Venice of Savoie, Savoie being the name of the department of France that we're in right now. Later, the Rhone went through another narrow gorge at La Baume. So you have to ride on the main road which cuts through the cliff via 3 short tunnels. The first 2 were fine and they actually had a narrow bike lane, although dimly lit. But we got really scared in the 3rd one because of the incredible roar of a truck coming up behind us and passing us. It's amazing how a tunnel intensifies the sound. Scenery was wonderful today, and the day ended at Murs et Jalonneux at a campground with a pool. That ride from Basel was about 60 kilometres and took us to the bottom of this loop in the river. From here, the Rhone changes direction, heading northwest along the southernmost foothills of the Jura Mountains, and then westwards towards Lyon. We're in an area known as Beaujolais, which also lends its name to a lesser-known wine region. The upcoming route meanders on both sides of the river through farmland and small villages on pathways and quiet roads. The pretty Glandew waterfall was well worth the small detour early in the day. Camping tonight was in a unique facility called Espace Eau Vive on Isle de la Serre in the Rhone. This is a water park with courses for all kinds of paddle sports, and by regulating the waterway running through the island, they can create whitewater conditions. However, we had other kinds of watery conditions in our tent in the middle of the night, as torrential rain turned our grassy spot into a shallow pond. So at 2 a.m. we relocated our sleeping mats to an event tent that wasn't in use, and we had a good rest of the night. By now it's June 15th, and we're heading out on our 9th day of cycling the Via Rhona. Small quiet roads brought us through characterful villages, many with stone houses and even the old traditional stone roofs. We cut the day a bit short after just 34 kilometres, after being warned about a severe storm which we could see looming up ahead. A campground a few kilometres off the route near Saint-Romain-de-Jalonnais had cabins for rent, and we got inside just as the heavens opened. And yes, this is Frank in his underwear running out to bring the bikes in gear under the porch with sheets of rain coming down off the roof. The rest of the evening was enjoyed in the luxury of the little cabin. There happened to be an important Gallo-Roman archaeological site right beside our campground, so we went to check that out in the morning. Called Vernaille, it was the site of a very grand Roman villa. Following that, we made our way along a fairly convoluted route towards Lyon on quiet roads. This was the section we found to have the poorest signage so far. I think we lost the official trail several times. Somewhere in this confusing bit we met Alan, a Frenchman who was riding EuroVelo 17 in the same direction as us. We helped each other get our bikes over a big fallen tree on the trail, and then we caught up with him again in the park near Lyon and had a good chat. We enjoyed his sense of humour. Once we got to John's, the routing became easier and it followed the Canal de Jonage and various pleasant greenways through the massive grand park Mirabel Jonage right into central Lyon and down along the river. Being a sunny Sunday, families were all out enjoying picnics by the lakes and strolling along the river. Somewhere in the park we encountered the very first sign showing the distance to the sea. Although Lyon has lots of interesting sights and it's said to be the gastronomical capital of France, we hadn't planned to linger there very long. This is where we'd be flying out of eventually, but that wasn't for another 3 weeks. Instead, we headed straight for the Part 2 train station to fast-forward our journey past the busy roads and industrial section between Lyon and Vienne, and even further on to the city of Valence, just in order to keep us on track to meet our friends in a couple of days. In a way, it was a pity to skip Vienne and nearby Saint-Romain-en-Galles, as there's a wealth of Roman history there. And south of Vienne, the Via Rhona runs between steep vineyards and dense orchards. However, sometimes you just can't do it all. We rolled into Valence in the early evening, and it was getting dark by the time we cycled south a further 12 kilometres to find a campground and cooked up dinner in the dark. We did 66 kilometres by bike today and about 100 by train. Here on the west side of the Rhone, we're now in the department of Ardèche, although the Via Rhona will flip-flop back and forth to the east side of the river into the department called Rhone. Generally flat riverside tracks, greenways and quiet roads took us down along the river, sometimes along flood dikes and a canalised part of the river, under limestone hills that in places are quarried for cement. At the town of Rochemore, a recently reopened 19th century suspension footbridge carries cyclists across the river. Its 3 bridge towers were designed to replicate the nearby Rochemore Castle. We head on down past the town of Montélimar, famous for its nougat production, eventually entering the charming village of Châteauneuf-du-Rhône, where we found a pleasant municipal campground. "13 kilometres from Châteauneuf-du-Rhône, on the Ardèche side of the river, lies the restored medieval village of Saint-Montagne. This is where we had arranged to meet our friends Jacques and Angela today. It was an easy ride to the village, initially following the Via Rhona and then veering off on some quiet roads where we saw our first field of lavender. It had been 20 years since we'd seen our friends, and we were so excited to meet them for lunch. Afterwards, we explored the village, which, by the way, is definitely worth a detour off EuroVelo 17 to check out. And then our friends drove us to their home not far from here, where we had an amazing 6 days relaxing and exploring some of the beautiful Ardèche countryside with them. On June 24th, we bade farewell to our friends and got back on the bikes to continue our ride towards Avignon. The roads were scenic and quiet as we made our way back towards the Rhone. We took time for the small detour to the medieval village of Gorges, perched picturesquely above the Ardèche River and the entrance to the gorge of the same name. At the town of Pont-Saint-Esprit, we rejoined the Via Rhona. From here, though, the route wasn't so straightforward, and it had us on some quite busy roads on the west side of the Rhone. I struggled quite a bit due to the 36-degree temperatures. We later saw maps showing EuroVelo 17 had been rerouted to the east side of the river, south of Pont-Saint-Esprit, contrary to what was shown on our map, so it was no wonder we were confused. Anyway, we still rode 77 kilometres and ended up in a nice campground north of Avignon on Isle des Papes around 8 p.m. At this point in the trip, we made a radical decision. The temperatures forecast for the next week were to be in the high 30s and low 40s, more typical for July and August than for May in this region. And neither of us were particularly keen to cycle in this heat down towards the Rhone Delta, where the salt flats in the Camargue region would offer zero shade. So, we decided to rent a car in Avignon and finish our tour on 4 wheels with air conditioning. So the 13-kilometre ride into Avignon on our 14th day on EuroVelo 17 would be our last. The cycle route continues another 100 kilometres approximately to the sea at Port St. Louis, or if you take the other route more to the southwest, it's about 160 kilometres to the Mediterranean. We would miss the chance to see flamingos in the salt flats and possibly wild horses in the Camargue area, but maybe some other time. Arriving in Avignon was exciting. It's really impressive, surrounded by 5 kilometres of ramparts with 39 towers, and famous as the Papal City in the 14th century. We toured the Palace of the Popes and strolled along the enchanting streets of the Old Town, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And then it was time to pick up the car and begin our exploration of Provence. First stop on the tour was the ancient Roman aqueduct bridge from the 1st century, the Pont du Gard. Then several historic villages before we headed south towards the coast, the Côte d'Azur to be precise. It was June 30th when we started heading inland and north towards the spectacular Parc du Verdon. While touring with the car, we continued camping and cooked up most of our dinners on our little stove. We did add a cooler to our kitchen though, although it became very difficult to find ice in the supermarkets, maybe due to the heat wave. And of course we did also enjoy lots of the local delicacies. We thought the idea of food trucks in campgrounds was brilliant, and we had some delicious paella from one in the Riez campground. There's no end to the number of gorgeous villages you could explore here, and we visited many. Roussillon is known for its ochre dye, and you can take a walk on the pathways through the old ochre quarries. And I got my wish to see more lavender fields. We gotten a great flavour of southern Provence, including driving to the top of Mont Ventoux and surviving a dodgy car park. So we decided to make our way further north, eventually leaving the region of Provence and Côte d'Azur as we headed towards Grenoble and the Alps. As Chamonix was within a couple of hours' drive now, Frank got his wish when we drove there and got up at the crack of dawn to beat the crowds to take the Aiguille du Midi cable car, where today Mount Blanc obliged by revealing her summit in the sun for long enough to get this view, truly the icing on the cake. The great thing about having the car was it made it very easy to stop at a number of bike shops along the way in search of bike boxes. So in the campground near Chamonix, the bikes were disassembled and packed in their boxes ready for the next day when we'd be making a hasty drive west towards the airport at Lyon. But with time for one more stop in the stunningly picturesque but also very touristy town of Annecy. And so we'd reached the end of our almost 2-week car tour and were once again back close to the Rhone River, where our earlier cycle journey had taken us from the Alps to Avignon. Out of the 1,100-ish kilometres of the full EuroVelo 17, we had ridden about 750. And when added to the section we'd ridden before that across France on EuroVelo 6, our total was about 2,280 kilometres over 6 leisurely weeks. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again on another ride very soon.